Hi, everybody. Following last week's wonderful chat with Lee Jussum, a psychologist, today I've got another wonderful guest, economist Mark Perry. How you doing, Mark?
Very good, God.
It's very nice to have you on the show. For those of you who may not know who Mark is, he is a professor of finance and economics at University of Michigan, Flint. He is also a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I've had, to my best recollection, at least one other person from the AEI. That's Christina Huff Summers on the show. And he is also a prolific writer on his blog, Carpe Diem, which I highly suggest that you check out. Did I miss anything from your bio that people should know about?
No, that covers it.
And before we got online, we were talking about whether Montreal is a colder place than where Mark currently is in Minnesota. And I suggested that Minnesota might be the only place that can actually compete with the frozen tundra of Montreal. But anyways,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. The ice box of the nation here is where I'm at.
Why aren't you in Southern California if you've got no geographical restrictions? It always seems to me like an irrational choice for anyone not to be in Southern California. Explain that to me, Mr. Economist.
Well, this is where I'm returning to my native village, as they say in India. So this is hometown Minnesota. So St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities. So, but
Gotcha.
I'll get on. I was just in Washington D.C. for 2 weeks, so it was a lot warmer there. No snow. Now I'm back in the snow belt, and then in a few weeks I'll be in Las Vegas, and then Phoenix, and then in the Caribbean in March. So yeah, I'll be making some trips away from the icebox.
Very nice. So I thought we would start with, I guess, what I'm most familiar with in terms of your work, and that is your assiduous and dogged battle using Title IX to argue against sex-based discrimination in universities. Maybe you can give us the full story there, Mark.
Yeah, well, I've been on this mission now for about 4 years, and I'm kind of going up against higher education's blind spot, I think, for sex discrimination. And so while preferences for men are not tolerated, discrimination against women is not tolerated, but then there's this institutional blind spot, I would say, in America's higher education system where they are perfectly tolerant of special preferences for women and discrimination against men. And so I started on this mission about 4 years ago when I challenged the women-only study lounge at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, and successfully challenged their what I call gender apartheid, where they had dedicated a whole wing of the student union building for women only. And then I went from there and challenged some programs at my own university, at University of Michigan Flint. I challenged 3 female-only faculty awards that had been in place for decades, I think, and include cash awards plus teaching time release, which, as you know, is kind of gold for professors to get time away from the classroom. And so those were then converted into all gender awards that are now open to all faculty members. And then I challenged a new summer camp at the University of Michigan Flint that was set up and designed for girls only in middle school, and it was called GEMS, the Girls in Engineering, Math, and Science. And they sent out literature in 2017, and we're proud of this new sexist, single-sex, girl-only summer STEM camp. And so I immediately challenged that internally, and that was then overturned, and they had to convert that program into a legitimate co-ed all-gender program, and that's how it exists today. And then from there, starting in 2017, I started challenging the University of Michigan system, including Flint and Dearborn and Ann Arbor. And there's a federal investigation now at the University of Michigan. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, I've now filed almost 100 different Title IX complaints against American universities and colleges, and now some public school systems for sponsoring and offering and operating and funding and hosting single-sex, girl-only or female-only programs. And as a result of those 100 Title IX complaints, now I just got another notification today. So there's 41 federal investigations that have been opened by the Office for Civil Rights, which is part of the Department of Education. And so 41 different universities and colleges across the country are now being investigated for violating Title IX Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1972. And the way it's worded, it says no person. The way it's interpreted is no woman, but the way it was written is no person on the basis of sex shall be excluded from or be denied educational benefits or be discriminated against based on their sex in any institution that accepts federal financial assistance, which is about every university in the United States except maybe Hillsdale College. And so as a condition of getting federal funding through grants and other types of federal funding, universities then are obligated to enforce federal civil rights laws that include a prohibition of discrimination based on sex. But what has happened, the Michigan State University case was an example, was like a physical or symbolic representation of what happens across the country at universities in every state, where they do not enforce Title IX when there are special preferences, illegal special preferences for women and illegal discrimination against men. And so what I'm finding, it's a very slow process. You know, the federal government, the wheels of justice turn very slowly, I guess, in terms of Title IX. But what I've been finding is that in every case when there's been a resolution, that it's been a resolution in my favor. So I think once even the Office for Civil Rights, even if they have not been used to dealing with complaints of sex discrimination against men, I think if they're lawyers and investigators and they apply the law consistently, it seems like they have been agreeing with my challenges that it's just not legal once you accept federal money to offer programs that are single-sex, girl-only or female-only programs. And so I guess I'm finding that I've got the law on my side, and I'm just asking for an equal, consistent application and enforcement of Title IX, where in higher education, even though there's armies of diversicrats and all we hear about is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there's hundreds of versocrats, as I call them, at major universities, they have done a very, very poor job of monitoring their own violations of federal civil rights laws. And so that's where I'm finding a little bit disappointing that I'm having to do this, even though there's people who are paid very high salaries to be in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what I'm finding is that they preach about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what they practice is uniformity, inequity, and exclusion when they're running single-sex, sexist, female-only scholarships, programs, fellowships, awards, summer STEM camps, clubs, all these different programs. And so that's what I'm doing, is challenging kind of the status quo in higher education and finding so far that my efforts have been successful, and I'm planning and hopefully going to prevail in the 40 investigations that are currently open, and then the other 40 or 50 cases that I presented that are now under review for Title IX violations.
So, I mean, to me, it seems as though it's a no-brainer that these realities should not exist, and yet they do. So when the train of exclusion, as you called it, first began, and when people are now defending those practices, if I'm going to be charitable, I'm going to argue that, it comes from a noble place in the following sense. Historically, women were discriminated against, and now we are reversing that trend. Of course, the problem with that narrative, as I've argued, and I'm certain that you're familiar with that data. So I've referred to data from a few years ago, US data, looking at educational attainment, so associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctorate across 5 racial groups. So it's a 4x5 table, if you like, matrix. So there are 20 possible cells that we could analyze. And if you look at the ratio of male to female graduates, in 20 out of the 20 cells, women outnumber men. So you couldn't have factual, real data that is more contrary to the narrative that, it is scary for women to walk into a campus. And yet, I guess one of the frailties of the human mind is that we don't adjust from our anchored positions once new evidence comes in. So is this really what's happening, that people come from a noble place, they want to set past grievances straight, but yet they can't adjust to the fact that those past grievances are no longer relevant. Is that the problem?
Well, sure. And I mean, we've always heard about the feminist agenda for gender equality and gender parity, but now it's even gone beyond that. And it's no longer about parity. It's about payback and privilege and power and preferences for women. And as you point out, I've done the same type of analysis extensively for U.S. higher education. And what I find interesting is that in 1972, which was when Title IX was passed to help make sure that women weren't facing any obstacles or challenges or discrimination in higher education, by 1979, women outnumbered men for college enrollment at all levels. And by the early 1980s, women outnumbered men for bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. So for about 40 years almost, men have been an underrepresented minority in higher education. And once women got, the majority of college degrees at the bachelor level, at master's level, and now even at the doctoral level, that since 1982, when women started outnumbering men and became the majority gender for college degrees, they've been awarded a cumulative 13 million degrees more than men have. So there's been this kind of cumulative gender college degree gap favoring women. I think it's now up to almost 14 million more women have gotten college degrees than men. So by any measure, it's men who are the underrepresented minority. And so I think what's happened, as you kind of pointed out, we're stuck in a mentality back in the 1950s and 1960s when women maybe were facing obstacles and challenges in higher education. But now that's been completely reversed. I've called it the most remarkable educational success story in American history, that women went from a minority to a majority, and now kind of, at the bachelor's level, about 57% of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. They outnumber men in most of the college degree programs. They're still underrepresented in, science and, well, not all sciences. They outnumber men in biology. We never hear about that, the underrepresentation of men in biology. All we hear about is the underrepresentation of women in tech, computer science, and engineering, but we never hear about the overall underrepresentation of men overall, and also in degree programs like education, psychology, nursing, foreign languages, and all of the, most of the college degrees are, men are a minority in most of the college degree programs. So I think part of it is we're stuck back in the 60s and 70s as if women are weak and inferior and facing challenges and obstacles. And yet they're not. It's now men who are the ones facing challenges and obstacles, and yet a disproportionate share of campus resources keeps going to women. Almost every college campus in America has a women's center or a women's education center or a women's commission. In my case, at University of Michigan Flint, there was, for a long time, since I've been there for more than 20 years, there was a women's educational center that was mostly for women. Then about 5 or 6 years ago, they supplemented that with a women's commission. And so now there were two main groups on campus that were advocating and looking at needs and for concerns of women, even though women now represent about 60% of the graduates at University of Michigan Flint. So again, I think it's this outdated mentality, and maybe it's just the grievance industry, whether it's for race or sex or gender, they never want to give up the power that they seem to be able to wield once they're advocating for grievances, or they're grievance hustlers, I guess, as Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell would, call Reverend Al Sharpton. So maybe it's the same thing in higher education, that the women's centers and women in general have this very loud voice. And so it just seems to be an outdated way of looking at higher education. And now it's men that maybe could use some help.
Well, as a behavioral scientist, as a psychologist, I'm always interested in studying what are the psychological processes by which people form, beliefs. How do they navigate through information? And so I think maybe one of the ways by which people can still hold on to this narrative of victimology, despite contrary evidence, is the following. Let me first set it up, and then I'll give the specific example. So if I approach, say, in a classroom, if I'm lecturing about some evolutionary principle, some evolved sex differences, men are exhibit a sexual dimorphism such that they are, on average, bigger than women, taller than women. Then someone will raise their hand and say, but Dr. Saad, my Aunt Julie is taller than my Uncle Bob. Oh, damn, Darwinian theory is dead. Back to the drawing boards, right? So therefore, they use a singular datum to falsify a statement that is true at the population level. So now let me apply this to what we're talking about. So even though we've both now shared data that demonstrates that at the aggregate level, using a very, very broad stroke of data, women outnumber men, then someone will come along and say, but no, at Oberlin, for full professors in the physics department, in astrophysics, there are 3 male professors and 1 female professor. Aha, that's where the patriarchy hides its nefarious goals, right? So as long as I can come up with a singular example where women don't dominate, then that means we have more work to do. Do you think that it could be as simple as what I just said? Because otherwise, what could compel them to continue preaching the victimology narrative when all the data suggests otherwise? There's no rational way to explain it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So what they do is they take a very isolated look. They look at all of the 20 or 30 major college degrees, and women dominate men or outnumber men in most of them and have for a long time. And the disparity is getting, bigger over time. But then they'll look at the 2 areas in higher education, which is computer science and engineering, where in both of those fields, women only get about 20% of their degrees. So then what they'll say is, yeah, these are high-paying degrees, and this shows that the patriarchy still exists in these isolated, sectors of higher education. So the job is not done. We have to advocate for more money for women in STEM, faculty in STEM, and so then that becomes the focal point. And so I've looked at that a lot too, and I think that the data show that only about 1% of college women who graduate with a bachelor's degree in the United States major in computer science. That's been pretty constant for about the last 10 or 15 years. Actually, it used to be higher than that. And so as an overall share of computer science degrees, the female share is about 20%. And so about 1% of women major in computer science, about 5% of men major. And so overall, since there's more women than men, it turns out that a female share of computer science degrees is about 20%. It's been stuck at about 20% for about 10 years or more, and actually used to be much higher back in the 1980s. So I would say that over time, this the economic concept of revealed preference, that people reveal their preferences based on their actions and choices, and that women have revealed their preferences that maybe they can code, but maybe they just don't like to go into computer coding as much as we all think they should. So there's this whole industry in the United States, starting in 3rd grade, with girls who code. There's Black girls who code. There's Latina girls who code. There's a national group called Project Scientist, which you wouldn't know by the name, but they advocate and they have special camps and programs for girls. There's another one called Expanding Your Horizons, which also doesn't reveal its agenda, but it's another national program to expand girls' horizons. So starting in 3rd grade, there's been this national effort with tons of money. You look at girls who code, they get millions and millions of corporate donations because I think it sells to the virtue signaling corporations that want to demonstrate their wokeness.
Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates is a perfect example. She recently posted some tweet about, protecting women and so on. And she was doing exactly that, virtue signaling.
Well, she's pledged $1 billion over the next 10 years to close what she calls the gender gaps, that maybe there's not as many women as men on corporate boards or CEOs or in Congress. But then they ignore all these other gaps that, favor women and disfavor men. So there's this huge industry to push girls. I call it, just a form of social engineering, to push girls into the fields where they have been historically underrepresented, and they still continue to be underrepresented. And yet they haven't been able to move the needle. In fact, I just posted a few weeks ago about the computer science professor at University of Washington. Oh, let me turn that phone off. Yeah, sorry. Who said that in his experience, computer science professor, that it's probably 20% of women in tech and in STEM and computer science is about all we're ever going to be able to hope for. So And yet they won't accept that. So again, they focus on the two areas, computer technology or computer science, information sciences, and engineering, and then say, well, look, at women are still underrepresented there, so there still must be a problem. We have to dump all of this money starting at third grade to force girls to go into coding and tech. And yet the results are showing, again, if we look at the data, which they probably don't care about, if they can sell this narrative and get corporate sponsorship, that then they haven't really been able to encourage more girls to go into STEM, or maybe they start in STEM when they get to college, but then they shift into some other field once they figure out that it's not exactly what they wanted. And also, there was a recent study I thought was interesting that women are more conscious of their grade point average than men. And so when they, in tech courses and in the tech field, computer science, engineering, they haven't had as much grade inflation as in, let's say, education or communications. And so they shift out of computer science and engineering into softer fields because they want to graduate with a higher GPA. And so the solution from these professors was, well, we have to have grade inflation in tech so that the girls get higher, women get higher grades in engineering and computer science. So they stay in that field. So anyway, the point I was making, of course, is there's this huge push to force more girls into the areas that they have been historically underrepresented. And I'm suggesting, along with this computer science professor at the University of Washington, that it's going to be a futile effort, and that we can, try to socially engineer the outcomes that we think are the best. But there are areas, like I mentioned, in biology, that's been 60% female share of college degrees for a long time. Veterinary medicine is now 80% female and 20% male. So there are areas, and especially if we include, extend STEM into the healthcare professions, they even sometimes call it STEM-H. So if you include healthcare professions as a science field and include that in STEM, then really it's like 50-50 overall for college degrees, according to the National Science Foundation. They put out data every couple of years on science, what they call science and engineering degrees. And in science, they include social sciences like psychology. And when they include those social sciences as part of sciences and then include engineering, that's exactly about 50-50. So again, I think what they've done is they've had to generate this narrative that women are underrepresented in computer science and engineering, and then put all this effort and then say, well, still the job is not done until we get gender parity in engineering, even though they don't care about all the gender disparities favoring women in all these other fields. So,
well, it seems like there's blowback, I think, when I'm speaking. Can you hear the blowback?
No.
No. Okay, it's coming on my end. I hope that people won't complain. But in any case, the what I call the DI cult members, DI diversity, inclusion, and equity, the DI religion, the bottom line, even if we don't ascribe to them any sinister motives, they are certainly succumbing to something that obviously you're aware of, but maybe some of our viewers are not, this equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunities. So, I mean, how is it possible that someone with a functioning brain who is making, I've looked at your data, and actually I cited in my forthcoming book where you look at the salaries of these, DI ministers, $400,000 and so on, more than what 4 professors make combined. How is it possible that someone who is supposed to be, a reasonably sophisticated thinker, a functioning adult, not understand the difference between equality of outcomes and equality of opportunities? Because I speak to some of these people, and that is exactly what they repeat when they are saying, when they are justifying these programs. How could one explain such astonishing idiocy?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, other than it fulfills their agenda, and they've got this growing diversocracy or the diversocrat bureaucracy that is expanding and metastasizing across higher education. But yeah, I mean, Milton Friedman pointed this out. He was the first one that kind of opened my eyes to this, the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And so to assume that any disparities in outcome have to then be attributed to either racism or sexism or something nefarious, yeah, I don't know where people get that thinking, other than that they've never really been trained on how to interpret statistics, or they just have never been trained in how to think logically and consistently. And then now that it's starting and spreading across higher education, it really sells. I mean, again, you can kind of see this all started about 10 years ago, this whole emphasis on diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think it's part of a bigger problem in higher education, which is the bureaucratic bloat. So, I mean, the bureaucracy, the bloated bureaucracy, or bureaucratic blight, as some professors maybe would think of it as. And so it's just this expansion of bureaucracy. And so I think then the diversity bureaucracy kind of tapped into that. And then that now has just become accepted. And as I've traced, I did like a 10-year analysis. And because the University of Michigan, as a public university, puts out annual salary reports that are available to the public, Excel spreadsheets, and I don't know, there's 5,000 employees or something at all three campuses. So I started searching the data on salaries and professors and staff and administrators, and then their job title. And the first time I could find any mention of anybody's title that included the words diversity, equity, or inclusion was about 10 years ago. And it started in the human resources area. And then it started expanding. And then every year by year, there were more staff members whose job title included either diversity, equity, or inclusion. And I don't know about in Canada, but in the United States, it's become centralized. So then there's these offices for diversity, equity, and inclusion that have the highly paid diversicrats that make more than $400,000 a year. And, you can go from 100 to 200,000 as a faculty member and then become a diversity officer and then double or triple your salary by going into the diversity administration. And so then it's also now started to become decentralized. So there's the centralized diversity offices, and then it becomes decentralized. So now, like at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, almost every major college and program has a diversity officer. And the library has diversity officers. And so the School of Nursing has a diversity officer. I'm not sure the goal is to recruit more men. It might be to recruit more women of color or something. And then, of course, all the engineering schools and departments and colleges across the country have diversity officers, and they have whole departments in women in science and engineering. And then all of the different programs and schools and colleges have their own diversity officers. And so that's what we've seen happen. And again, this is just maybe can be traced to the fact that you're citing that people don't know that diversity and outcome is a natural consequence of just competition and differences in biology and effort and so on. And yet they see any differences in outcome have to be because there wasn't enough emphasis on diversity. And so then that creates this whole bureaucracy, and then they have to fix these problems that they see that really are just natural consequences and outcomes. And of course, they don't ever object when the outcomes are in what they would consider to be their favor. So if there's 80% of women majoring now in veterinary medicine, and they just consider that to be just a natural consequence of women are smarter. But if there's 80% of men in tech and only 20% of women, then that has to be traced to patriarchy, sexism, victimhood, and then that then requires some agenda to fix it. So
how does the fact that you are obviously someone who is not towing the line, towing the narrative, how have you been accepted by your fellow academics when you go to the proverbial departmental lunch, or when you're sitting at the departmental meeting, or when you're walking down the hallways at your university? Do you get a lot of blowback? Have you been ostracized? Have you had to pay any professional costs for doing the horrifying analyses rooted in facts that you have?
No, really, I've been kind of surprised that mostly I've gotten support. Of course, there's a million college professors in the United States, and I'm the only one I know about who so far has been willing to stand up to the diversity army and stand up and
you can't think of one professor in Canada who might be standing up to this? Maybe a professor in Montreal. You can't think of one?
Well, yeah, I'm talking about the United States.
I see. Okay, yeah. You're not looking globally. Got you. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So I am in a very, very tiny minority. But what I've found is that it seems like it's kind of hard to object, even on campus when I challenge the female-only faculty awards. like, what would be their defense? Would they want to say that either, okay, well, we don't agree with Title IX anymore, or we want to abolish Title IX, or we want our university to stop accepting federal funding so we don't have to comply with Title IX? I'm not sure how they could even come up with a legal defense for sex discrimination, and maybe they would still think it's still desirable because it's some kind of payback or something. But I've been, relatively surprised, I guess, that I haven't gotten a lot of hate mail. And partly because I'm not on campus as much as I used to be. I'm only on a half-time appointment because I spend time in Washington, D.C. And like this semester, I'm teaching online. So, and I'm in the business school, the School of Management, which is generally more conservative than if I was in the, College of Arts and Sciences. So I've been kind of surprised that, I haven't gotten more, blowback or negative feedback. I mean, the big one was when I challenged the Michigan State University Women Only Lounge, and the university then quietly shut it down over the summer and reconfigured it and remodeled it so that then they could say, well, now it's a new use and now it's open to everybody. And the women, once they found out, went pretty crazy, and then there was sit-ins and protests and demonstrations, and they're signing petitions, and they really were upset with me that I had taken away or was responsible for taking away the privilege that they had. And so again, like Thomas Sowell said, that when certain groups are so used to getting special preferences that then they look at equal treatment as a form of discrimination. So I saw that was a perfect example of that here they had this privilege that the men on campus didn't have. They were privileged to have this gender apartheid system in their favor for this special place on campus where men couldn't go in. And then when it was open up to all students of all genders, then they looked at that as a form of discrimination against women, and they fought for it. But at that point, the university couldn't justify it anymore because their federal funding was at stake if they continued in this form of discrimination. So really, I've gotten a lot of private emails from professors who support what I'm doing. What I found is they are not willing to do it themselves. They don't want to go public and challenge their university's women-only scholarships program.
And I will add at the end of the emails that they send you, let me predict what's the last line. And hey, Mark, please make sure to not make my support of you public. Let's keep this between us.
Oh, of course. Yeah. They make it clear that they are not willing, even though some professors at major universities who have contacted me have tenure, they're protected by tenure, so they wouldn't be able to be fired just for reporting civil rights violations. And yet they're just afraid of the blowback that they experience. So I'm the guy who will do it for anybody who sends me valid information on sex discrimination. And so I don't mind doing it. I just wish there was, 100 other people like me doing this, that then the universities would be a lot less likely to be able to try to get away with this.
I know that you, of course, have dealt with this particular issue, the Title IX issue. You've dealt with, empirically, attacking, if you'd like, or critiquing the gender gap narrative. So, both of these issues deal with, sex differences. Are there other, what I call in my forthcoming book, idea pathogens that you're as interested in exploring? So, for example, if I look at my own, public engagement, I simply try to attack any level of, intellectual terrorism, anything that attacks truth, anything that is contrary to critical thinking, to reason, to science, to evidence-based thinking. So it could be postmodernism, it could be biophobia, fear of using biology to explain human behavior, it could be radical feminism, it could be cultural relativism. So is there a reason why you're particularly focused on sex differences? Is it because you feel that it's more amenable to empirical refutation, or why isn't it that you have not expanded, or have you expanded to other issues?
No, I've kind of focused a lot of my blog over the last 10 years on gender differences in general, including, gender differences and outcomes in higher education. I've looked at, of course, gender differences in wages, and looked at the supposed alleged gender earnings gap, and have written a lot about that. I've looked at gender differences in test scores, and so I find it kind of fascinating that for the last 40 years or more that boys in the United States taking the math SAT test have outperformed girls by a significant difference, and that outcome favoring boys in greater math aptitude, at least as measured by the SAT, has been consistent and over 30 or 40 years. And yet we hear all the time that men and women, or there's no difference between girls and boys in terms of mathematical abilities, and yet that data point at least kind of refutes that. And I guess I got started on this, speaking of Christina Summers, who's a good friend of mine. And about, 10 years ago or a little more, during the Great Recession of 2007, 8, and 9, I started noticing the differences in the impact on men and women of the Great Recession in the United States. And so in terms of job losses and unemployment rates, it was clear that the Great Recession disproportionately affected men adversely compared to women. And in fact, it eventually became, somebody named it the Man-cession after some of the articles that I had written. And then the name kind of stuck with the research I'd been doing. So that was kind of my first, I guess, kind of research project on looking at the differences between men and women and how they suffered over the Great Depression, or the Great Recession. And of course, men were more predominantly represented in the fields that got hurt the most, which was, construction got hit terribly hard, and manufacturing and financial services. So that kind of, and then Christina Summers kind of was using some of the data that I was providing. And so that, I guess that was kind of the precursor to my interest then. And then since I'm in higher education, I kind of was always interested in gender and sex differences in higher education, just the outcomes. And again, the false narrative that women are behind when you look at the data, and it's been clear for 40 years. It's men who have fallen behind 40 years ago, and we're still in this 1960s mentality. But yeah, so then I started looking at those data. So I guess what really interests me is anything where I can get hard data. So like in higher education, there's very good, reliable annual data from the Department of Education on outcomes, and then you can break it, or they report it by gender differences or gender outcomes. And so then I can look at that. And so that then is kind of where I've focused on. I've also looked again, at the gender earnings gap has been a kind of a favorite topic of mine, and I've looked at that. Now, there it's not as easy to get, real fine, micro data, but again, we can look at the aggregate data and kind of explain why there are differences. So yeah, so I'm kind of data driven, and so I guess that's what got me into a lot of analysis.
Now you're obviously in your, I guess you're maybe a couple of years younger. What you got your PhD in the mid 90s, was it 97?
93 at George Mason.
93.
Yeah.
Okay, so almost the same time as me. So you've certainly been a professor for many years. You've done the the whole peer reviewed publishing stuff, which is of course a central feature of what we do as academics. But of course you're one of the rare professors, and as I am, who likes to use whatever platform they have to reach a broader audience. So yes, it's wonderful, and it continues to be a dogged passion of mine to publish journal papers in top journals and so on. But I also want to hold chats like we're holding now, and I want to get on popular shows, and I want to write my Psychology Today blog. You've got your Carpe Diem blog. So number one, when is it that you started getting the itch to try to reach a larger audience? And then secondly, how can we get more of our colleagues to receive that same itch? Because again, I think that too few of us leave the proverbial lab to communicate with the larger audience.
Yeah, well, ever since I graduated, George Mason's kind of a special place because it's very kind of policy oriented and not as mathematical as a lot of the other, PhD programs. So ever since I graduated in 1993, I'd always had an interest in writing op-ed pieces. And so over the years have written, hundreds of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and USA Today and Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, and so on. And so I always had that kind of interest in writing to a general audience through op-eds. And of course, Milton Friedman was famous for doing that for 20 years, I think, at Newsweek. Of course, Thomas Sowell had major influence in the United States, writing a weekly column. Walter Williams at George Mason, one of my professors, also still has a weekly syndicated column. So I'd always kind of admired Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams for their, op-eds and newspaper columns. And then around 2006 was right when a lot of the blogs were starting to become, popular. And so I remember the first blog I started reading was Marginal Revolution. Tyler Cowen, who is at George Mason, and he was on my dissertation committee. So I knew Tyler, and then his co-blogger, Alex Kabarock at Marginal Revolution. He was a classmate of mine at George Mason, so I knew those two guys from graduate school. And so I would read the Marginal Revolution blog. I think they started around 2003, maybe, and have blogged almost every day since then. And then about 2005, then Cafe Hayek started with Don Boudreau and Russ Roberts at George Mason. And I knew Don Boudreau because I had been his research assistant back when I was in grad school, and he was a young professor. And now Russ Roberts left, and it's Cafe Hayek is Don Boudreau only. And so those were the first early influences on me in terms of the new technology at that time, which was a new platform, I guess, was blogging. And so then in the fall of 2006, I had just gotten full professor. So I wasn't under as much pressure anymore to publish, peer-reviewed journal articles that nobody would read. And so then I thought, okay, so yeah, I'll start a blog and just see how it goes. And so nobody had the name Carpe Diem. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a good Latin name to have as a kind of a seize the day, as kind of a positive blog name. And so then started blogging, and then wasn't sure if it would work or not. But then 3 or 4 months after I started blogging, I had got a call from CNBC. This is back when Larry Kudlow, who's now one of Trump's advisors, had his CNBC show, Kudlow and Company. And the producer asked if I was available to do a segment that night or the next night. And I said I was. And I said, well, how did this all come about? And she said, well, Larry Kudlow is a big fan of your blog, because I was always from the beginning trying to set my blog apart a little bit by doing graphs and charts and tables and figures and maps and Venn diagrams and more graphics. And a lot of blogs are usually mostly text only, and so it gets a little bit boring. So I thought, I'm going to make a difference here, make a distinction, have a niche with making it very visual. And so I was presenting a lot of data about the economy. And so then I thought, okay, so now it seems like I'm successful. Larry Kudlow at CNBC is asking me to be a guest on a show. And so then that gave me kind of the incentive, motivation to keep going. And so now it's been almost 14 years. I try to put up daily content. And so that's how I got into the blogosphere. And then I've been able to reach a pretty large audience. And so at AEI.org, which is the host for my blog, when I do the Google Analytics, sometimes 30 or 40% of all the traffic coming into American Enterprise Institute is coming into my blog. And at the end of the year, I always do like the top 20 most viewed publications, either on my blog or on all of AEI. And so most of the top 15 or 20, top 10, 15 or 20 publications or posts are most widely read, widely viewed, were the ones that I had on Carpe Diem. So I'm still reaching a pretty wide audience. And so that's my platform, and that's kind of my focus and my passion. And what I try to do almost every day is put up content.
And my second question was, how can we get other academics to be bitten by the same desire to reach a larger audience?
Yeah. And, I think part of it is the incentive structure in higher education. So, when you do your annual activity report and you say, I've had 2 or 3 publications in peer-reviewed journals, that gets a lot of credit. If you say, well, I've put up 200 blog posts or written 5 op-eds, even if they're in the Wall Street Journal, often, depending again on the dean or the executive committee or the department chair of the school, then often they won't put a lot of value or weight on op-eds or blogging. So I know, like at George Mason, where it's kind of the blogging center, economic blogging center of the universe, I guess, with Marginal Revolution and Cafe Hayek and some of the other blogs there with Brian Kaplan and so on, that I think in their annual reviews, they might put more emphasis because they would see that as valuable contribution for a scholar to make. So I guess, that's going to take a long time to change at standard universities. But I think that, and I think some professors, they might be really smart, but they have a hard time in the transition from writing scholarly articles in a certain journalistic style and into a 750 word op-ed format or 600 word op-ed format, where it's a completely different kind of writing style. So sometimes they have a trouble making that transition, and even though if they want to, they have a hard time. But I agree that it'd be better for everybody if we could reach a wider audience as academics and as professors by trying to appeal to a general audience through op-eds and through blogging and through the types of platforms that you're using with your videos and so on, so podcasts.
So I think the changing structure of the incentivization is one that one can hope optimistically that could be malleable. It could be changed. The second one that you mentioned, which is getting professors to alter their communication styles or their writing styles to fit new mediums other than the peer-reviewed journal, even that one could argue could be learned. I think the third one that you didn't mention, which might be the one that is the least malleable, is that I think it takes a unique set of personality traits to be willing to put yourself out there instead of to 7 readers who constitute the typical number of readers who are going to read your peer-reviewed journal, to 7 million, to 70 million. I've appeared on shows that have 20 million downloads. I mean, my own channel has close to now almost 20 million views. So I think what ends up happening with a lot of professors is that they master the rules of engagement of the peer-reviewed journal, having spent many years training within that template. And regrettably, they are, if I'm going to put it, charitably, they're uncomfortable to then, open up their ideas to a wider audience. And okay, so let me not be charitable. In a sense, they're cowardly. It takes a lot of testicular fortitude to say, here I am. I mean, to borrow Martin Luther, here I stand, right? Look, I get, 99% of the feedback that I get from, a very large platform is very positive, but 1% of a very large number can still be a quite daunting tsunami of hate. So you have to have a particular type of personality structure to be able to put your ideas to the test to a larger audience. Do you think that that's something that we can actually train professors to overcome? Or is that basically just you either have the innate personality disposition to do it or not, and that's it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've thought about that a lot because I've noticed the cowardliness of a lot of my colleagues, at my own university and then throughout higher education, which seems, troubling in a way or kind of ironic that we have the tenure system in place to give professors, to protect professors when they're taking controversial positions. But it just seems like I've noticed, okay, so a professor gets tenure and now they're an associate professor. But then they're protected with tenure, but now they have to wait. They want to become a full professor. And so they don't want to do anything controversial until they become full professor. And maybe by the time they become full professor, halfway through their academic career, they're so beat down that they're just so afraid to take on any controversy. And so I've just been really surprised and a little disappointed that we have this system to protect college professors with tenure to allow them to be able to take controversial positions, and yet so few professors seem to be willing to take advantage of that incredible benefit that they have that somebody in private industry would never have. And even maybe, if you work for the government. So where else could you be, intellectually curious and interested and be protected from being fired with a tenure system that allows you to be controversial, not have to worry about your job security, and yet so few professors seem to be willing to do that. I don't know how we can change that. Now, maybe with Twitter, I think that's another platform that I think has been very popular. I use it a lot. You have a lot of followers on Twitter, and yet maybe that's another example of where professors are afraid to make their opinions public on Twitter. Just because, again, they're so afraid of taking on controversial positions. But it just seems like now that there's more avenues than ever to express your opinion through social media, Twitter as an example, blogs, Facebook, YouTube videos, it would seem like this is like the golden age of the golden age. Yeah, and yet there's this repression that maybe it's just the tyranny of the status quo, or we just haven't gotten professors out of that, groupthink of not wanting to do anything controversial? I'm not sure. It's a really good question. I don't have a lot of good answers, but good to talk about that.
So I thought we would pivot for the last part of our chat to speaking about, marrying some of your academic interests in economics with some of mine. I guess we'll go maybe if you're available for another maybe 15 minutes. Do you think that works?
Yeah.
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 So I, as you may know, I apply evolutionary psychology in studying consumer behavior, but my original training was in psychology of decision making, very much from the Tversky and Kahneman tradition. My supervisor, who's a cognitive psychologist, Jay Russo, went to school with Kahneman and Tversky at University of Michigan, actually, Ann Arbor, in psychology department. One of my professors, Dick Thaler, won recently the Nobel Prize. So I come from the tradition of behavioral decision theory and behavioral economics, but then where I departed away from some of that framework is in that I became not disillusioned, but maybe slightly bored with the constant demonstrations by behavioral scientists that classical economists were wrong in their view of Homo economicus, right? This became known facetiously as the violation of the month club, right? Some psychologists would come up with yet another experiment to demonstrate that the axioms of rational choice as postulated in economics were wrong. And I get it. I mean, we get it. I mean, that view of Homo economicus is a mythical creature that doesn't exist. It only exists in the recesses of the economist's mind. And so I was much more interested in the evolutionary reasons why the human mind has the architecture that it has. And so that's how I veered into evolutionary psychology and decision making. But from your perspective, do you feel that evolutionary thinking has not sufficiently been infused within economic theory, whether it be at the macroeconomic level or the micro economic theories? What are your thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, well, I haven't really thought too much about it. I guess, on one hand, in economics, we assume that actors and decision makers are rational, which maybe applies some of the time, not all of the time. But then we also recognize the subjectivity of decision making. And then there's the de gustibus non disputandum, that there's no arguing about people's human preferences or tastes or subjective opinions. And so maybe there's that dichotomy in economics that we want to assume rationality because it makes it easy to assume that everybody's engaged in some kind of maximizing behavior, right, that firms are maximizing profits and politicians are maximizing votes or political support, and consumers are maximizing utility, which we can't really measure. But again, we assume that individuals are engaged in some kind of maximizing behavior. And so maybe it's that it's not always rational decision making, but that they are maximizing their utility in maybe some flawed model. And so maybe that's where there's some tension between assuming rational decision making, and then there's the subjectivity that then means that people don't always act rationally. And so I don't know if that kind of helps explain my position.
I think what you're calling subjectivity is what a psychologist would call the evolutionary reality of why people make choices the way that they do. It's the tension, I think, between normative decision making, which is the world that economists live in, and descriptive decision making, right? Which is, I don't care whether I abide by some stylized rational view of how I ought to behave. I want to study precisely how people behave. I don't care that they should abide by the transitivity axiom. So for those of you who don't know, if I prefer car A to car B and I prefer car B to car C, then I must prefer car A to car C. That seems like something that I should do rationally, and yet Amos Tversky demonstrated in 1969 that people don't abide by even this simple axioms of rational choice. So I think that might be the tension, in that economists are trying to come up with these normative models, perhaps because they're trying to simplify the world, whereas the psychologist is saying, no, I want to get in the dirty stuff. I want to understand that epsilon that you put all of the variance into. I want to understand why there is behavioral heterogeneity. So isn't that really the tension between the two groups? They're each pursuing a laudable goal, but really they have, in a sense, different mission statements.
Yeah, and maybe even within economics, as we talked about before, I mean, it has become very, very mathematical over time, to the point that they often say now that if you want to get a PhD in economics, it's better to get an undergraduate degree in mathematics than a degree in economics. Easier to pick up the economics later if you have a strong math background, whereas if you have a strong econ background and weak mathematical background, it's harder to pick up the math. So I'm sure that that's probably true. Most of the PhD programs are very, very mathematical. So maybe that's where kind of economics went in that direction with mathematics and statistics, and so then everything is quantifiable. And yet, then there's the Austrian school of economics, which really doesn't have any math to it at all, and maybe treats it more, the market as a process, and maybe that fits in more with the, what you're talking about from a psychological standpoint, where and I would say, Thomas Sowell just wrote his book on the basic economics, where there wasn't a single equation or graph or chart. It was completely text. So maybe that's kind of the answer, is to treat economics, which we know is a social science. So it's about how people behave in a market economy or in a non-market economy. And so it is about human behavior, and which is then going to be subjective and not necessarily subject to mathematical equations. And so maybe there's that tension even within the mathematical profession against the math geeks and the quants versus the more Austrian type, economists like Pete Boettke, for example, Steve Horwitz, who are more into the Austrian way of thinking, which is non-mathematical. And maybe I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure.
Incidentally, I am one of those guys who has an undergraduate in mathematics, and I've got all the mathematics pedigree. And then when I went for my PhD at Cornell, it was really to be a quant jock, to be a quantoid. And then I was turned into a behavioral scientist by certainly through a lot of the nudging of my eventual doctoral supervisor, Jay Russo. He was actually very interested in working with me precisely because I had a math background and a computer science background. And so he thought that I would be sort of a bridge between quant boy and a behavioral scientist. And then I ended up being bitten by the evolutionary psychology bug, and then there goes my career. But I want to propose to you a theory that might be a bit speculative, but of course, I'd love to hear your comments about it. So one of the reasons I think that economists have gone on mathematics on steroids, and why, just so that you don't think I'm attacking economists, let me turn it to behavioral sciences, why behavioral scientists engage in extraordinarily rigorous, 2x3x4 design, MANOVA, ANCOVA, LISRO, right? All the fancy methodology is really not because those tools are always needed, but and here maybe I'm being Freudian. So in the same way that Freud had, you have penis envy, here you have a form of physics envy, right? I want to be accepted at the pantheon of serious sciences. And one of the ways that I can demonstrate that, hey, I'm just as good as those bastard physicists, is that I can demonstrate to you that I quack like a duck and walk like a duck, therefore I must be a duck. So if I'm an economist, I do that through let lambda be double lambda, triple star, eigenvalue matrix, Jacobi matrix. It's all bullshit. It's all got nothing to do with any reality. But my God, those Greek letters are going to intimidate you to death, asshole. And by the same token, this is what happens in the behavioral sciences, where you have unbelievably elaborate experiments. But then the final conclusion is, consumers who love a restaurant are more likely to return to that restaurant. Golly gee, who could have predicted that, right? But the data analyses, the methodological rigor is so developed that it looks profound, a sense of full profundity. Do you think that I'm onto something, or am I too much relying on my Sigmund Freud hat?
No, and I think, if we trace the emphasis on mathematics and economics throughout the history, that I'm sure it really became more elevated on steroids, as you put it, over the last 25 or 30 years when the computer power became more available. And so then if we think of not just mathematics, theoretical mathematics, but then statistical analysis of economic data, I did my dissertation in 1993 back when a new statistical technique came out that was called GARCH, Generalized Autoregressive Conditional Heteroscedasticity, which probably now...
I have a headache just hearing you say that.
Yeah. So, now that's probably already outdated, but at the time, that was a new statistical technique to kind of model variability over time or something. And so maybe it's with all and that was in 93. So since then, things have gotten a lot more complicated. So maybe because of computing power and the statistical influence, not just mathematics, but statistics, may have contributed to, this kind of quant on steroids. And maybe, I don't know, I guess I'm not sure exactly how to think about, I think there could be something to it that maybe mathematics, it's a Nobel science. So there's medicine and physics and chemistry, and so economics. So they want to kind of be in the same group that everything is quantifiable. And so maybe it's some way to get respect. So maybe it's just a combination of, the statistical influence and computer power making all of these new statistical analyses possible that weren't possible before. And so that became a new way to kind of data mine or statistical mine, come up with new dissertation topics, because now you could take something and do some new statistical technique, whatever it is, vector autoregression or autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity, whatever it is. And now you can analyze data. And then maybe also the availability of data has contributed to that too. Now there's so much data. The St. Louis Fed has, 200,000 data series. So now you can get access to data. That makes it more likely that you would do a data-based research project or dissertation than writing something a little bit more subjective or qualitative. So maybe it's some envy of high-powered data, high-powered math, high-powered statistics, and physics envy.
And I also think, and I discussed this, there's a lot of blowback from my voice, but I hope it doesn't come out in the final taping. But anyways, in my forthcoming book, I talk about at one point, how do you get at truth? And then I warn against faux profundity. And so one of the examples I use, which in a sense follows from our discussion of, the over mathematical approach in economics or the over methodological rigor in the behavioral sciences, is if you look, for example, at the brain imaging paradigm. So the brain imaging paradigm is, so fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is of course, there's a field of neuroeconomics, there's neuromarketing that applies fMRI methodology to study consumer decision-making or economic decision-making. And so the methodology itself feels sciencey. It feels profound. Therefore, it becomes like the tail wagging the proverbial dog, right? There's actually studies that have looked at where you take the exact same paper, academic paper, and you either put a photo from an fMRI or not. And the one that it's the exact same paper, it's the same thing. But the one that has that brain image is judged as more austere, more serious, more sciencey, because the multicolored brain imaging neural activation patterns just feel sciencey. And so this is what so I had a cognitive psychology professor in my doctoral training. His name is Frank Kyle, who's now at Yale. He talks about the illusion of explanatory depth. I talk about the illusion of explanatory profundity, right? It just feels profound when I just slap onto anything a picture of an fMRI. So I think the similar thing happens in economics, similar thing happens in the behavioral sciences, similar thing happens in postmodernism, as I explain in my book, where by simply engaging in an endless gibberish of nonsensical words, you end up sounding as though you're saying something profound, where in reality you're just bullshitting. And so I think we really have to protect against that. I think that some of the most important science is actually very simple to teach. So if I look at some of the most important experiments in the history of psychology, I could literally explain them to my young children, and they don't care about the statistical analysis, but the setup of the experiment and then what it demonstrates is very simple to explain. But what makes it incredibly powerful experiment is that it is so simple and elegant in demonstrating something so powerful. So once we enter into triple integral and Gaussian and Jacobian matrices, and again, I'm not denigrating it, I'm a quant boy, I come from that tradition, then you're losing a bit of the epistemological honesty of what it is to pursue truth, right?
Oh, sure. And I see that in economics a lot, that you've run all these different regressions and come up with some result. But then again, what is the policy implication? What does that make? Is there any difference in the real world, or for average person, or even for a corporation or for an investment manager? And so much of it is irrelevant to the real world, in which case, it really has a negative social value, because if you look at all of the costs involved, with all of that research and then look at the benefits are negligible and there's a huge amount of cost. So then a lot of this research ends up really with a negative social value, looking at all the costs and benefits. So then you just wonder, why do we put up with that? And why isn't there more of an emphasis on just explaining something that has some real world implication or policy implication instead of just, running a bunch of regressions and then finding some statistically significant results on some coefficients. And then that's the main point and goal. So, I would say that that's kind of a downfall, I guess, of academic research is that so little of it, at least in economics, has any true, real value to society.
Well, and especially when you're housed in the business school, right? And again, I'm not suggesting that all of research should be judged by the clear path to its practicality, because look, there are some theorems from number theory, a very pure mathematics field, from the days of Fermat, several hundred years ago, that were cracked and that sat and collected dust for 300 years with no practical application until then cryptography came along. So I'm not suggesting that one should only do research that has immediate practical value. But certainly, if you are housed in a business school, you'd like to think that whatever fancy scientific approach you're taking to study a phenomenon, that phenomenon is rooted in reality. You are truly trying to describe something. So in my courses, when, let's say MBA students come in, I tell them, don't worry, you didn't wrongly fall into a class of evolutionary biology. It's going to feel as though I'm doing it's as if you're in an evolutionary biology class, but then I'm going to show you how we apply this evolutionary biological thinking to real business problems. I make the link to the so what. If managers were sitting in this room, how would they benefit of understanding human nature? And I think too few, certainly folks housed at the business school, care to make that link, which is quite ironic.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So if a CEO or an executive or somebody, anybody from a corporation was sitting in a class, and then would there be any real world implications for them when they go about making decisions? And sometimes there is a connection between what the professors are talking about and the real world. But then other times, it's kind of this exercise often just to do research because that's what pays. And so you just want to have research published, whether or not. So it's never really a concern of a lot of professors that this would have any real world implications, which is maybe kind of a defect or a flaw, or something that it would be better if it wasn't exactly like that.
I hear you. We're almost at the end, so this is the point where I ask my guests if they have any projects that they're currently working on that are not yet public that they'd like you to use this platform to promote. And so if you do, take it away, Professor Perry.
Yeah, no, I would just say that my main focus right now has been on my civil rights and Title IX efforts. And, I kind of do occasional updates on my blog about some of my successes or new complaints or new investigations. But I maybe at some point I should really put this into either a longer article or something where I could maybe create a website, because I think it's really important what I'm doing. And I get contacted all the time by people who have interest and wanting help. So maybe I don't have anything specific right now, but at some point, maybe I'll have some either document or a website or something to really maybe kind of more formalize the efforts that I'm engaged in now and will be for at least the next couple of years on trying to advance civil rights and higher education in the United States.
Well, as they say, you're doing the Lord's work. Thank you so much for joining us. If any of you viewers appreciate these types of conversations, please consider supporting the channel in any way that you can. Stay on the line for a second, Mark. Thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person soon.
Yeah, thank you, God.
Cheers.